Also welcome from my side. For those of you who still don't know me yet, my name is Karlsson. I work for GData. That's an antivirus company located here in Bochum, and we are supporting this course by offering an additional evening event. I know today we have some big party here at the university, so I don't expect many of you to join us later, but if you are interested, here you can see the details, and if you have further questions, come to me after the talk. Actually, today I also like to make an announcement for another thing. I don't know how many of you have heard about this conference called Spring. It is a little bit special because it is addressing thesis workers who are writing their bachelor, master, or even PhD thesis. So there's a platform where you can present your ongoing work. You don't have to have a finished thesis in your hands. You can present ongoing work there. It's always in another location, and this time we are quite happy to have it here in our company. So if you possibly write your thesis or interesting stuff you like to present in a small field, if you want to get in touch with people working on similar topics at other universities, you are welcome to join us. Basically the topic of this stuff is reactive security. The conference itself is basically in German, but it's also possible to present something in English. And we are planning to extend the call for papers, or in this case, call for abstracts a little longer. So if it sounds interesting for you, you can come to me for more details. Otherwise, we also have a website and an email address to contact the responsible people at our company. So yes, that's from my side. And now let's enjoy the talk.
All right. Let's see if I can get this up here. Hello everyone, and welcome to this lecture. Today we are going to talk about polyglot payloads in practice. But first, let me introduce myself, as I'm sure that not many of you know who I am. My name is Mathias Karlsson. I'm Swedish, 23 years old, originally from Stockholm. But some of you might actually know me as Avlid i en brunn, which is what it says there on the second line, because that's what I call myself on Twitter and IRC and other shady places around the internet. During my free time, the small part of my free time, I do a lot of I think researching sounds too academic, because that's not really what I do. I spend a lot of time fiddling with different web security aspects. And if you fiddle around with stuff enough, sooner or later you will end up with something interesting. And when I do, I share that with the internet in the hopes of other people joining in to create something bigger out of it. So that's what I do in my spare time. I also play some capture the flag competitions, I'm sure you know that, and participate in a bunch of bug bounty programs too, just to exercise my web pen test skills. But as they mentioned, I am also the founder of Detectify, which is a Swedish web security startup based in Stockholm, of course. And currently we provide a web application scanning service as a service, but we have some other tricks up our sleeves that is up and coming. So my position at Detectify, or what I do there, except for what every founder would do, is I make sure that we stay on top on the new stuff in web security. So my job is to know when the new stuff comes out, so that we can implement it before everyone else. But that's not what I'm going to talk about today. Today we're going to talk about one of my favorite subjects of fiddling that I have been doing in the past year or so, which is polyglot payloads. Some of you might already know what it is, some of you might not know what it is. So here's my definition of what it is. When I say polyglot payload in this lecture, what I mean is a payload that can be used in more than one context and still be treated as valid data. So if you have two vulnerabilities in two different web applications, one here, one here. The traditional way to test these is to create one payload for this context and try that, one payload for this context and try that. However, polyglot payloads allows you to create one payload that you can send for both vulnerabilities and get the expected results. One payload, more than one context. Polyglot payload. And I started to get interested in this, like I said, around a year ago, because I found some files that people had been making for quite some time that was like, if you open them as one format, it would work. And if you open them as another format, it will work. So that was pretty cool. I was wondering, how did I do that? But I didn't look into it too much then, until I saw some shellcode, actually. And this shellcode that someone made could be executed in two different computer or CPU architectures and still execute valid code. And that's when I thought, that is really interesting, because if we can use polyglots in binary attacks, that's not so far away from web attacks. So I started looking around for these polyglots in web attacks, and I couldn't find that much on it. Sure, there was these files that I was talking about, and some people had been using these files in web attacks, and there's some great research on that, but I was thinking more like these regular payloads. You know, SQL injections, cross-site scripting, basic web stuff. Why was nobody doing polyglots for these scenarios? So I thought, well, if nobody else is going to do it, I'm going to do it. And so I started looking at the payloads that I was sending. And if you don't think you've used a polyglot, the first thing I realized when I looked at the payloads that I was using from a day-to-day basis was that they are already polyglots. I just didn't realize it. So I'm sure that you all recognize this payload. Classic SQL injection. Quote or quote quote equals quote. This is in fact a polyglot payload. And I'm going to tell you why. Imagine this scenario. MySQL, and you can inject where it says here. This payload would work in that context. Now, if we look at the second context that I have as an example, here, it would actually work in this context too, even though this one is an update statement and is within parentheses. Now, some of you might think, well, that's not really two contexts. Both of them are MySQL and single quotes. But then, let's take a look at this. And now we're not even talking about MySQL injections anymore, because this very same payload will work in this like an XPath injection too. So that got me thinking, like, what other payloads am I using for exploiting web applications or polyglots? And what are the scenarios that they miss? Can I take these ones that I've already been using and make them better? So I sat down and I asked myself, if I made them better, what could I achieve? So the one question I had is, what if there are vulnerabilities in web applications that can only be found through polyglot payloads? If I can prove that there was a vulnerability that you couldn't find in this traditional way, then maybe traditional testing with one payload per context wasn't as effective as I thought. Because I had looked at many of our open source competitors in the scanners, and many of them work like this. One per context, send it, and when we've covered all the context, we're done. But maybe that wasn't enough. And speaking of scanners, I also had an optimization thought, because if I could create one payload to cover 3 contexts, that would mean I would have to send 1 request instead of 3 requests, which would save me a lot of time when I scan stuff. And scan time is one of the most importance factors for automated tools. So that was also one of the reasons why I wanted to look into this. So I did for over a year, and the stuff that I came up with and how I did it, I'm here to present to you today. So let's take a look at what we're going to talk about from now on. Introduction, we're done with that. Why should we use these polyglots? We're done with that. How to create them, I'm going to talk about that. How to create them for MySQL injections, for cross-site scripting, these file polyglots that I mentioned. And then I'm going to talk about polyglots in practice. I'm going to show you a real-world example that I have done in this last year when I exploited a web application, and I couldn't have done it if I didn't know what these polyglots were and how to make them. And then I'm going to talk about polyglots for other purposes than exploitation. And then I have a secret little finish that I don't want to spoil. So, without all the fuss, let's get into it. Creating polyglot payloads. To understand my technique for creating these multi-purpose payloads, we must first understand my basic view of payloads. When I have a payload, I split it up into 3 parts. And I'm not sure if the terminology is correct on this, but this is what I call it. Okay? So we have the execution zone. The execution zone is what I call the part of the payload that is supposed to be executed as code. Okay? So in a cross-site scripting, alert 1. In a MySQL injection, the actual query, buffer overflow, your shellcode. Okay? And then we have dead zone, which is basically everything else. Every part of the payload that is not supposed to be executed as code. So for instance, in an SQL injection, it could be a string inside the SQL query, or a multi-line comment, or something like that, where you can put stuff and it won't be executed as code. And then I have the breaker sequence, or the terminator, which is the sequence of characters that will make it go from one of the zones to the other. So if we're inside a single quoted string, the breaker sequence would be a single quote. Because the moment the interpreter will find the single quote, we will change context and will be in the execution zone instead. This is basically how I break it up. And I'll tell you why now. Because when combining payloads, what I do is, first off, I define all the contexts that I want to include in my combined payload, or in my polyglot. And then I create one payload per context. So for instance, in MySQL, we could create one for single quotes, one for double quotes, and one for no quotes at all. And then one at a time, I would take the previous payload, and then I would take the next payload and put it into a dead zone of the previous payload. And what I will end up with is a bigger payload that will work in both contexts. And then I take the third and do the same thing, etc., until I'm done. But what if there's no dead zones available? That means we can't combine them anymore. Well, then you can create one or insert one into the payload. So if we keep talking about MySQL, we could add a multi-line comment, and then we would have these dead zone that we can keep combining the payloads with. If that's not possible, and I'm sorry if this is getting too complicated, but if that's not possible, we can create the execution zones. But to do that, the 2 payloads, or whatever's interpreted in the 2 payloads, must share syntax. So both of them can execute the code. So let's take a look at how we implement this method of combining payloads. I've already been talking about MySQL injections, so let's see how I did it. I talked about the 3 contexts like this. So I define them with single quote, double quote, straight into query, and I create 3 payloads. Each of these payloads will execute the function sleep with argument 1, just to prove that it works, much like alert 1 if it would be a cross-site scripting attack. So how do we go on about combining these? Well, we take the first one and the second one. We fingerprint the dead zones of the first one. There we have one, and there we have one. And both of those dead zones are terminated by a single quote. Since there are no single quotes in the second payload, we can put it into the dead zone of one of the others. I chose the latter one. What we end up then with is this. This payload would work in the single quote context and the double quote context. But we still have one left, which is straight into the query. And there I only wrote this. And the problem here is that we don't have any dead zones in this one. But as I told you, we can insert one. So that's what we're going to do. Now all of a sudden, we have a dead zone. And that dead zone will be terminated by the asterisk and the slash. And since asterisk and the slash sequence isn't in the second payload, we can just combine them. And we end up with this. And this is the final version. Works in single quote context, double quote context, and straight into the query context. So that's the basic method I have been using to combine payloads to make these polyglots. So this was the first one I made, and then I thought, well, what if I just got lucky? What if it just works in MySQL? So I wanted to try something on a web attack that has a lot more contexts. So naturally, I go at cross-site scripting attacks because there's a shitload of different ways to execute JavaScript by putting user data into different part of a HTML document. But without explaining every step of the way, what I did was, and I'm sorry if the font is too small on this one, I put up 7 contexts because I thought if I can do more than double, like the last one, that should be enough. And to put it in code, these are the 7 contexts. So I wrote one payload for each of these contexts, and then I combined them, just like I showed you with the SQL injection payloads. And you can see every step of the way here. But my point is that it worked, and I ended up with this. And this payload works in at least 7 different cross-site scripting contexts, and it can be extended even more. We could keep adding contexts and adding the next payload into a dead zone of the previous payload. So now that we know why we should create these payloads, how we create these payloads for common web application attacks, let's look at what I mentioned in the beginning, the file polyglots. Now, there's many ways you can combine 2 files, but I'm going to cover the easiest way to create a polyglot file. Because you see, file formats are usually very easy to understand, at least most of them. So in really short, it usually contains a header that will tell how the file will look like, the contents of the file, and then sometimes something that will say this is the end of the file. And Then that file will be sent off to an interpreter or a renderer, or depending on what file type it is. And these renderers or interpreters or whatever are sometimes lazy or built for convenience. So sometimes they will allow stuff before the actual file. So they will take the file and read it like this, and like, is the header at offset 0? No. 1? No. 3? I mean 2? Yes. And then when it finds the header, it will pass the rest of the file and not give a crap about what's after the file or before the file. An example of a file format that works like this and is used commonly on the web is PDF. You can put anything you want before the PDF header, like %PDF, and you can put anything after it. You can put almost anything before it, and I'll get back to you why it's almost. So anyway, but not all file types are like this. For instance, another file type that's used widely on the web, SVF, you can't have anything before the SVF header in the file, but after all the frames and the end of the file, you can put whatever you like. So, to combine an SVF file and PDF file is actually super easy. All you have to do is put the SVF file on top and then the PDF file under it. Save it and you got yourself a polyglot file. Not all file formats work like this, but this is definitely the easiest way to create file polyglots. So now we know how to create these things. Let's talk about putting it to use. Let's watch a real-world example of an attack that I created sometime in the past year. Now I have changed the company name to something completely different, just so you guys know. So story time, listen up. This is the story about human verification at PlayPal. So I started this PlayPal pen test like I would any other. I started to look for web applications within the scope. And I found one in particular, and I started a list of observations. I always do this. And the first observation I made, it looked vulnerable. And now that might seem crazy, but I bet you all know what I mean. You look at it, and like the CSS is kind of skewed, and you hover a link, and it's like ID equals 7, and like, okay, give me time, and this stuff has to break. But anyway, another observation I did was that I could upload PDF files, and the PDF files would be served in line. And in other words, it would not send a content disposition attachment header. So if I open it in my browser, it wouldn't download. This is crucial to this attack, so remember that. Was kind of annoying though, because they had human verification on this PDF of the content. So every time I uploaded a file, it took 2 hours before it would be accepted, so I can play around with it. And the fourth observation I did was, it was built on WordPress, which means it was built on PHP. And this is always good news, because it's easy to make mistakes with such a language. But anyway, if we look at the second point there, I could upload a file that would be served in line. That, if you can upload a file that will be served in line without a check of the actual contents of the file, you got yourself a recipe for something called Flash content type sniffing. Now, for everyone watching on the stream who already knows about Flash content type sniffing, you can skip this part, but I'm quickly going to go through how Flash content type sniffing attacks work. It's based on 2 problems in the Flash implementation today. The first problem is that if you embed a file on attacker.com from victim.com, the Flash plugin will render it as Flash as long as the file contains valid flash data, even if the content type of the file is TXT or application JavaScript or whatever. The Flash plugin will not care about the content type. Okay? It needs to be a valid Flash file. The plugin container will care about the content disposition, though. If content disposition attachment header is sent, it won't render it. So that's why that was important. Now, the second error about Flash implementation today is that when we make requests from Flash, it will honor the same origin policy for the domain where the Flash file is hosted. Okay? So I tried to make some graphics here, but if I upload a SVF, which is like a text file with SVF content, here, I embed it with an object tag on my site, and then a visitor that is logged in on the victim site visits my site. I can read his stuff through Flash that he has on the victim site. So I can get his credentials and stuff, and as you might have already thought about, I can steal his CSRF tokens and do CSRF attacks. So that's how Flash content type sniffing works. And of course, I was going to do this. And I thought, all I have to do is this. I created an attack pattern. First, create a Flash file that will fetch the CSRF token across domain, upload it with the extension PDF. I would load it from my domain using an object tag, and then I would have the CSRF token. So that's what I did. I created the Flash file, changed the extension, went to the upload screen, waited freaking 2 hours, and your paper did not meet the requirements and was therefore declined. Son of a bitch. So, but I don't give up that easily. Because what if I can make it look like a Flash file and meet the requirements, which was look as a PDF file? You're probably thinking what I was thinking. I'm going to create a polyglot. So first I create this Flash file, then I combine it with a PDF, upload it to the server, wait 2 hours, embed it on my site, and then we could steal the CSRF token. Because when this human will open it in their Adobe Reader, it would look like this PDF file, but when I embed it on my site, it would look like a PDF. I mean SVF, which was great. But remember when I said that you can have almost anything before a PDF? Well, it turns out that you can't have a SVF file before PDF. So I was really bummed because I put the files like SVF, PDF, and it didn't work. So I was like, what? So I wrote like ASD, ASD, ASD before, and then it worked. So I was stuck. But luckily, a German guy saved me, because the very next day, actually, I go on Twitter, and this German guy, as I said, Alex, who calls himself Insert Script, posted this. Finished creating a valid Flash file, which is also a PDF and opens in all browsers plus Adobe Reader. Not as easy as I thought. It's impossible. I tried this yesterday. So I wrote him in like, man, how? I tried this. And well, it turns out he did what I should have done. Read the Flash specification. Turns out there are 3 kinds of Flash files. SWF, which is the normal kind of Flash file, SWC, which is the compressed version, and then there's SWZ, which is also a compressed version, but the Z version is compressed with 7-zip. And the best thing was, if I had this 7-zipped Flash file before the PDF file, it worked in Adobe Reader. So perfect. New attack pattern. Create a 7-zipped Flash file that will fetch the token, combine it with a PDF, that will make it through the human verification, upload it, load the file, get CSRF token. So, with my hopes up, I uploaded it, waited 2 hours, and your paper was approved. That felt good, and but it didn't stop there. You know, why stop just because you have the cookie? You know, bonus. Remember, I said they were running WordPress. Well, since they were running an open source system, they had a predictable backend. I knew how the backend looked, so I took advantage of this in my proof of concept. So, using the CSRF token, I changed the source code of one of their plugins, and essentially I end up with PHP code execution. So yeah, that's the story about how I found a web application vulnerability that could lead to PHP code execution that could not have been exploited without the use of a polyglot payload. So yeah. That's the story about that. So there are scenarios out there today that you can only find by using these payloads. So that's why you should start thinking about these and using them. But let's look at what other things we can do with polyglots. One thing I came up with was that I sat and read all these capture the flag write-ups, right? And I thought, it's always so boring. It's just the basic payloads. I mean, if you're going to spend so much time on doing this write-up, creating these payloads, why not make them aesthetically pleasing? So, instead of doing this in your write-up, why not do this? I mean, you almost never get extra points for show, but wouldn't it be awesome to check through some log sometime and then like, what? There's devil in there? Anyway, that's an idea I had. Another purpose that you can use this combination method for. But there are other purposes that you can use polyglots for. For instance, there's this paper called POC or Get the Fuck Out, which is, or actually it's a series of signs written by Tract Association of POC or Get the Fuck Out and Friends. And that's, well, Travis Goodspeed is one of them, and there's a bunch of other really brilliant people. And what's great about these signs, I mean, except for the content of the signs, is that they are polyglots. They are polyglot files, multiple polyglots. And the coolest thing I thought about this was that if you read issue number 3, and you think like, man, that was great, I want to read issue number 2. You know what? You already have issue number 2, because if you save the paper as zip, and you open that zip, you have the previous versions. And this was really, I think this is brilliant, which is why I wanted to mention this. And this is also another way that we can use these polyglots, you know, for purposes other than exploiting stuff. So yeah, I'm a bit fast on time. I guess I speak really fast. I'm sorry about that, but we have actually arrived to more or less the ending of this lecture. Pretty fast. But anyway, I had an idea when making these slides. I got to this point and I thought, okay, now I've talked about creating them and basically everything I wanted to talk about, but I felt kind of like a hypocrite. Because here I stand and I've been talking about cross-site scripting payload, SQL injection payload, other kind of payload, and file payloads. And I have a lecture about combining payloads. 4 payloads, combining payloads. Let's combine the combined payloads. So I thought, it would probably be pretty cool if I could combine all of these payloads that I've showed and make them into one big payload that would work. So the method I have been using, first off, we need to have all the context and payloads for all the context. So we had this for MySQL injections, we had this for cross-site scripting attacks, and then we talked about ASCII art as another purpose, payload, and then we also talked about file polyglots, right? So the first thing I went ahead and did was take the first one and combine it with the second one. And if you remember how I told you how to do that, I need a dead zone in the first one that I can put the second one in. Simple stuff. But here's the problem. Since I had used single quotes and double quotes in both the MySQL and JavaScript payloads, I was unable to create a dead zone for combining the payloads. And this really sucked because this meant that either I had to go back and re-engineer the payloads, or I needed to combine them in the execution zone, like I told you. And for that, I needed to create a snippet of code that would execute as one thing in MySQL and another thing in JavaScript. So I did that instead, and this is what I came up with. If you run this in MySQL, it will run sleep 1. If you run it in JavaScript, it will execute alert 1. Why does it do that? It does that because there's such a thing called conditional comments in MySQL. And conditional comments is basically if the multi-line comment begins with an exclamation point, it will execute the contents of that comment as it would any other SQL statement. So basically, put an exclamation point, and it will execute the contents as SQL. So knowing this, let's just quickly try to interpret this piece of code like MySQL would and then like JavaScript would to understand how it works. As for MySQL, it will execute it like this. The red part here would be the execution zone, as I called it, and the gray zone would be, well, the dead zone. So it starts with a conditional comment, executes sleep 1, makes a multi-line comment, and then stops the conditional comment. Easy. But as for JavaScript that doesn't have support for these conditional comment, it will interpret it like this. Start a multi-line comment, end the multi-line comment, execute alert 1, and then another multi-line comment. So that was perfect. We had the recipe that we needed to combine these two payloads. So that's what I did. But instead of putting the next payload into a dead zone of the other, I put it into the execution zone of the other. And instead of putting in alert 1, for instance, I would put in this kind of payload. Okay? And what I ended up with looks like this. This payload is a bit bigger, and it still works in all the 7 XSS contexts that I talked about. It still works in all the MySQL contexts that I talked about. And now we have 2 out of 4 payloads combined. And this is great news, because all we need to do now is add a dead zone to this one and put the next one in there. But to be able to put in a dead zone in this one, we need to have a shared dead zone. So something that creates a dead zone in JavaScript and MySQL. A multi-line comment. Works in both contexts. So that's great. That little gray part is a dead zone for both contexts. So let's go ahead and put some ASCII art in there. And now we have this payload with the beautiful Detectify logo in ASCII art in it, and it still works in all those contexts. So now we have 3 out of 4. Now we just need a file. So the first thing I did was this. Now it's a PHP file. But then I thought, meh, that's kind of lame. So, and I haven't really been talking about PHP that much anyways, so I put in a PDF instead. Because as I told you, we can have anything before and after. So I put in a PDF, and now we have this. And it still works in all these contexts, and it has ASCII art, and it's a PHP shell. And the final part about this payload quite literally, is if we save it as a PDF file, we get the final slide of this presentation. Is actually this payload. So with that, I hope I leave you with some more knowledge on how and why you should use these polyglots while testing web applications. If you have any question about this, as I'm sure you will have, please send them to me and Avlid Ian Berun on Twitter, or at the dinner, or just now afterwards. I will add a credit page to the slides, by the way, so you should download the slides too to see all the links that I have read to produce this material. I hope you have learned something, or at the very least enjoyed this as much as I did. Thank you for listening, and that's all.